When we read the story of the Damascus Road, we usually see it as a simple narrative of divine interruption. A man is walking down a path, doing terrible things, and God steps in to stop him. And we tend to read the blinding of Saul as a punishment, a divine penalty for hunting down the early church. It makes sense to us. If a man is breathing threats and murder, striking him into darkness feels like the exact kind of justice he deserves. But that reading misses the deeper, more profound architecture of what God is actually doing in this moment. The physical blindness of Saul was not a penalty. It was a diagnosis. It was a physical manifestation of an inward reality. To understand why God had to take this man's eyes, we first have to understand what Saul thought he was seeing. We often picture Saul of Tarsus as a one-dimensional villain, a man who simply hated the things of God. But the tragedy of Saul is far more complicated and far more dangerous. Saul did not hate God. He loved God. Or at least, he deeply loved his own rigid understanding of God. Saul was a Pharisee. He was trained under Gamaliel, one of the most respected biblical scholars in Jewish history. He knew the scriptures. He knew the covenants. He knew the law backward and forward. In his own words, found later in his letter to the Philippians, chapter 3, verses 4 through 6, Saul describes his religious resume. He writes that he was circumcised on the 8th day, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless. Notice that final word, faultless. Saul did not think he was a sinner in need of correction. He thought he possessed perfect, unclouded spiritual vision. He looked at the followers of Jesus of Nazareth and saw a dangerous heresy that threatened the purity of Israel. He looked at his own violent actions and saw holy zeal. He believed, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that he saw the will of God perfectly. He had the text. He had the tradition. He had the approval of the religious leaders. He was a man who believed he walked entirely in the light. Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, tells us that Saul went to the high priest and asked for letters to the synagogues in Damascus. He wanted permission to find anyone who belonged to the way, whether men or women, and bring them bound as prisoners to Jerusalem. This was not a man acting in a sudden, temporary fit of rage. This was calculated, organized, authorized violence. It was completely sanctioned by the religious establishment of his day. Saul was traveling exactly where he wanted to go, doing exactly what he thought heaven required. His entire worldview was locked into a rigid system of boundaries. There were the righteous, and there were the lawbreakers. There was the holy, and there was the profane. There was the inside, and there was the outside. And Saul knew exactly where every single line was drawn. His spiritual vision was, in his own mind, absolutely flawless. But God was about to show him that a man can have perfect religious certainty and still be completely in the dark. Damascus was not just another city on his map. It was the place where Saul's religious certainty was about to hit a wall of light. To understand how a man who loves God could become so dangerous, we have to look closely at the opening verse of Acts chapter 9. Luke, the author of Acts, uses a specific phrase to describe Saul's state of mind before he even sets foot on the road to Damascus. He writes that Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. Notice the word breathing. The original language carries the idea of inhaling and exhaling. It paints the picture of a man who is panting, almost like a warhorse anticipating the battle. Violence toward the early church was not just an item on Saul's religious checklist. It was his oxygen. He inhaled the defense of the law, and he exhaled destruction upon anyone who threatened it. We have to ask how a Pharisee, a man who dedicated his life to studying the Torah, arrived at this point. In the religious imagination of the first century, zeal was not a flaw. It was one of the highest virtues a person could possess. Saul knew the stories of his ancestors. He knew about Phinehas, who used a spear to stop the corruption of Israel in the wilderness. He knew about the prophet Elijah, who challenged the prophets of Baal and called down fire from heaven. Saul looked at his own life and believed he was simply taking his place in that long, honored lineage. He believed he was defending the holiness of God against a dangerous corruption. But this is the terrifying danger of religious zeal when it is disconnected from the actual heart of God. Zeal without revelation is just destruction wearing a holy mask. Saul had become so obsessed with protecting the boundaries of his religion that he was willing to kill the very people God was creating. His certainty had made him violent. His theology had made him cruel, and because he felt no guilt, there was nothing to slow him down. Acts tells us he went to the high priest in Jerusalem and asked for letters of authority. He wanted legal permission to march into the synagogues of Damascus, arrest the followers of Jesus, and drag them back in chains. Look at the geography of this decision. Damascus is roughly 150 miles north of Jerusalem. In the ancient world, traveling on foot or by animal, that is a journey of about a week. Think about the psychological weight of that walk. For 7 days, walking through the heat and dust of the ancient Near East, Saul had time to think. He had time to listen to the silence of the desert. He had time to remember the face of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, whose execution Saul had personally overseen just chapters earlier. He had days to reconsider, days to turn back, but he did not. Every step north was a reinforcement of his own rightness. Every mile hardened his resolve. A week-long journey like that requires a massive amount of sustained conviction. This was not a temporary lapse in judgment. It was the violent momentum of absolute certainty. Saul's physical eyes were working perfectly. He could see the road. He could see his companions. He could see the horizon drawing closer to the city where he planned to tear families apart in the name of God. But inwardly, the man was completely, entirely blind. He was a man moving at top speed, fully convinced that heaven was cheering him on. He was racing toward the city gates, completely unaware that he was actually racing toward a collision with the very God he thought he was defending. And that is exactly when the sky opened. Acts chapter 9, verse 3, describes the turning point of Saul's life with absolute suddenness. The text says that as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. We often imagine this like a spotlight. We picture a police helicopter turning its beam on a dangerous suspect to stop him in his tracks. But for a brilliantly educated Pharisee like Saul, a massive light from heaven meant something far more specific and far more terrifying. It meant the glory of God. In the biblical imagination, the terrifying, brilliant, heavy presence of God is often described as blinding light. It is the fire on Mount Sinai. It is the luminous cloud that filled the tabernacle. It is the unapproachable light of the divine throne room. Saul knew all of those texts. He had studied them his entire life. But according to the theology of a first-century Pharisee, the glory of God belonged in the holy city. It belonged in the temple in Jerusalem, guarded by the priests, protected by the law, and separated from the unclean Gentile world. Saul had just left Jerusalem to defend that exact system. He was walking into Syria, a Gentile territory, to arrest a group of people he believed were insulting the temple and corrupting the holiness of God. If you had asked Saul where a man might encounter the blazing glory of heaven, he would have pointed back south, toward the Holy of Holies. He never expected the glory of God to ambush him on a dusty road. When the light hits him, it completely reorients his biblical geography. God is not confined to the temple in Jerusalem. God has stepped out onto the road to Damascus. The text tells us his immediate reaction. He fell to the ground. This is not a man tripping over his own feet in surprise. This is the involuntary collapse of a human being encountering the divine. In the Hebrew scriptures, whenever a prophet sees the unveiled glory of God, their legs give out. Ezekiel saw the glory of the Lord and fell face down in the dirt. Daniel saw a vision of heaven and his strength left him completely. Saul is experiencing the exact same prophetic collapse. The man who was marching with the violent momentum of absolute certainty is suddenly driven into the dust. Years later, Paul would write about this exact moment. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6, he does not just describe it as a bright flash. He explains what was actually happening inside the light. He writes, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." Notice what he realizes. The glory of God was not tied to the temple stones Saul was defending. The glory of God was tied to the person he was hunting. As Saul lay in the dirt, his physical collapse was mirroring a theological collapse. Everything he thought he knew about who was holy, who was cursed, where God dwelled, and what God wanted, was breaking apart in real time. The light did not just blind him, it dismantled him. He was expecting to enter Damascus as a conqueror, a righteous judge executing the will of heaven. Instead, heaven had come down and brought the judge to his knees. But the light did not just stop his journey, It triggered the most profound theological crisis of his life, because out of that blinding light came a voice, and the single question that voice asked was about to shatter Saul's worldview forever. As Saul lies pressed against the dust of the Damascus road, his eyes overwhelmed by the unapproachable light, he hears a voice. Acts chapter 9, verse 4, records the exact words. The voice says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Before we look at the question, we have to look at how the voice addresses him. It does not call him by a title. It does not address him as a Pharisee or a scholar of the law. It repeats his name twice. Saul, Saul. In the biblical text, the double name is a deeply specific literary marker. It is never used casually. When God calls someone by their name twice, it marks a moment of profound intimacy, divine pivot, or deep pastoral correction. God called out, "Abraham, Abraham." To stop the knife on Mount Moriah, God called out, "Moses, Moses," from the burning bush. God called out, "Samuel, Samuel." In the silence of the tabernacle, the voice speaking from the light is not treating Saul like a random enemy. It is addressing him the way the God of Israel addresses his chosen servants. It is a voice of supreme authority, but also a voice of terrible, piercing intimacy. And then comes the question, why do you persecute me? This is the moment the earthquake happens in Saul's theology. Notice carefully what the voice does not say. It does not say, "Why are you persecuting my church?" It does not say, "Why are you hurting my followers?" It does not say, "Why are you arresting these innocent people?" The voice makes no distinction whatsoever between the people being hunted and the divine presence speaking from the sky. Saul is terrified. He knows he is experiencing a divine encounter. He knows this is heaven breaking open. So he asks the only question left for a man in his position. "Who are you, Lord?" The word he uses for Lord is a title of absolute submission. Pinned to the ground by divine glory, Saul is acknowledging that the one speaking holds supreme authority. He is waiting for the God of his ancestors to identify himself. And the answer he receives is the collapse of everything he has ever built his life upon. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random sequence of events. The journey, the light, the fall, and now the voice. They are systematically taking apart a man's understanding of God. Saul believed the followers of Jesus were a cancer on the people of Israel. He believed he was performing holy surgery to cut them out. He thought he was defending the honor of heaven by destroying them. But Jesus reveals a reality that shatters that framework. Jesus does not just defend his people from heaven. He identifies with them on earth. Completely. He binds his own identity to the very people Saul views as heretics. To strike them is to strike him. To chain them is to chain him. Later in his life, Paul will develop a massive theology around the idea that the church is the body of Christ. He will write that Christ is the head, and the believers are the members of the body. We often treat that like a beautiful poetic metaphor, but Paul did not learn that in a quiet classroom. He learned it face down in the dirt on the road to Damascus. He learned that the boundary lines he had drawn were completely wrong. He had built his life on the separation of the clean from the unclean, the righteous from the wicked, the insider from the outsider. But the glory of God had not appeared to commend his boundary lines. The glory of God had appeared in the face of the one he despised, speaking in the voice of the people he was trying to kill. In a matter of seconds, Saul's perfect spiritual vision is proven completely blind. His righteous zeal is revealed as violence against the God he claimed to serve. Saul is now on the ground, his entire worldview shattered in a single sentence. But what happens when he stands back up is the detail most people misunderstand. After the voice speaks, the light fades. The silence rushes back in. The men traveling with Saul are standing there speechless. They heard the sound but did not see anyone. Acts chapter 9, verse 8, describes what happens next. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. We have to slow down and look at this moment carefully, because this is where we usually make a theological mistake. We read this verse and assume God is simply punishing Saul for his cruelty. We think this is divine retaliation, an eye for an eye. But God is not simply breaking a man in anger. God is doing something far more profound and far more merciful. The blindness was not a penalty. It was a physical manifestation of Saul's inward reality. For his entire adult life, Saul believed he possessed perfect spiritual vision. He was a Pharisee. He knew the law. He could see exactly what God wanted and exactly who was failing to deliver it. But to understand what is happening to Saul on this dirt road, we have to remember what Jesus said about the Pharisees just a few years earlier. In the Gospel of John, chapter 9, Jesus heals a man who was born blind. The religious leaders, the Pharisees, are furious because Jesus did the healing on the Sabbath. They interrogate the man. They throw him out of the synagogue. And at the end of that chapter, Jesus looks at the Pharisees and says something terrifying. He says, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see and those who see will become blind." The Pharisees hear this and ask him, "Are we blind too?" Jesus answers them, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." Do you see the pattern? In the theology of Jesus, the most dangerous spiritual condition a person can be in is to be blind while being absolutely convinced that they can see. Because a person who knows they are blind will ask for help, but a person who thinks they have perfect vision will walk off a cliff, and they will drag other people down with them. Saul was in the most dangerous condition possible. He was completely blind to the grace of God, but he was holding the steering wheel of the religious establishment, driving straight toward destruction. So, on the Damascus road, Jesus does not just punish him, he diagnoses him. When Saul stands up and opens his eyes to darkness, God is finally forcing his physical body to match his spiritual soul. It was not a penalty, it was a mirror. For the first time in his life, Saul of Tarsus is experiencing the truth about himself. The illusion of his perfect vision has been shattered. Later in his life, in his letter to the Romans, Paul would describe the mindset of a strict religious teacher. He would write that such a person is convinced they are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark. That was exactly how Saul saw himself when he left Jerusalem, a guide for the blind. But now, the guide cannot even find the city gates. The text tells us that because he could not see, the men traveling with him had to lead him by the hand into Damascus. Think about the humiliation of that walk. He left Jerusalem as a conqueror. He was carrying letters of authority. He was the great inquisitor, a man of power, intellect, and zeal, ready to kick down doors and drag people out in chains. He arrives in Damascus, shuffling through the dust, stumbling, stripped of his power, being led by the hand like a helpless child. The violent momentum of his certainty has been completely broken. He has to be led by the hand into the city. And for 3 days, the text tells us something fascinating about what he did in the dark. Acts chapter 9, verse 9, contains one of the most profound sentences in the entire story. It says simply, "For 3 days he was blind, and did not eat or drink anything." 3 days. In the biblical imagination, 3 days is almost never just a measurement of time. It is a theological marker. It is the time Jonah spent in the belly of the great fish. It is the time Israel prepared before encountering God at Sinai. It is the time Jesus spent in the tomb. 3 days is the biblical space between death and resurrection. It is the dark, silent period where the old is buried before the new is brought to life. When Saul is led into a house on the street called Straight, he enters a tomb of his own. The text tells us he did not eat, and he did not drink. This is a total, absolute fast. In the ancient Jewish world, a person did not enter a severe fast casually. Fasting was the physical language of deep mourning, of profound repentance, and of begging God for mercy. Think about what is happening in the dark. Saul is completely isolated. He cannot see the sun. He cannot see his hands. He cannot read a scroll. All he has is his own mind and the terrible silence of his own thoughts. For his entire adult life, Saul had studied and memorized the Hebrew scriptures. He knew the prophecies of Isaiah. He knew the Psalms of David. He knew the intricate promises of the covenants. He had built a massive, impenetrable theological tower. And on the Damascus road, God had simply pushed it over. Now, for 3 days, sitting in absolute blackness, every single verse he ever memorized is playing back in his head. Only now, the center of gravity has completely shifted. Before the light hit him, he read the scriptures through the lens of strict, boundary-keeping Pharisaism. But now, The voice of Jesus is echoing over every text. He is realizing that the suffering servant of Isaiah chapter 53 was not a metaphor. It was the man his colleagues had crucified. He is realizing that the stone the builders rejected, spoken of in the Psalms, was the very cornerstone of what God was doing. He is realizing that in his violent zeal to protect the law, he had actually become the enemy of the God who gave it. This is not just a man waiting for his eyes to heal. This is a man whose entire religious universe is collapsing and being rebuilt from the ground up. The fasting is the outward sign of a man who is mourning the death of his old identity. Saul the Pharisee, the Hebrew of Hebrews, the faultless keeper of the law, is dying in that room, and he has to die. God cannot simply add Jesus to Saul's existing religious system. The old wineskin of his violent, self-righteous certainty would burst. He has to be emptied out completely. The darkness is the severe grace of God, stripping him down to nothing. He cannot rely on his resume. He cannot point to his zeal. He cannot rest on his perfect obedience, because all of those things, unchecked by grace, led him to become a murderer. For 3 days, Saul is reduced to a broken man sitting in the dark, entirely dependent on a God he just discovered he did not actually know. He is experiencing the absolute poverty of his own spirit. And in the kingdom of heaven, spiritual poverty is the exact prerequisite for true sight. But God does not leave him in the dark forever. While Saul is waiting in the tomb of his mind, God is moving on the other side of the city. He is speaking to a man named Ananias. And God is about to send the very kind of person Saul came to destroy to deliver the final reversal. God does not leave a broken man in the dark forever. While Saul is fasting in absolute blackness, Jesus appears in a vision to a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. Acts chapter 9 tells us that the Lord instructs Ananias to go to a specific house on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. Pause for a second and appreciate the absolute terror of this command. Ananias knows exactly who Saul is. He argues with the Lord. He says, "Lord, I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your holy people in Jerusalem. And he has come here with authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name." Ananias is effectively saying, "You are asking me to walk into the jaws of the wolf." But God tells him to go, because the wolf has been broken and he is waiting to be led. So Ananias obeys. He walks down the street, knocks on the door, and enters the room where the great, terrifying Pharisee is sitting blind and helpless. And the very first word out of Ananias's mouth is one of the most stunning moments of grace in the entire New Testament. He places his hands on the blind man and says, "Brother Saul, brother." The man who traveled 150 miles to put Ananias in chains is suddenly embraced as family. The hunted is extending grace to the hunter. The rigid boundary lines that Saul had spent his life defending are completely erased in a single greeting. Ananias tells him that Jesus, the one who appeared on the road, has sent him so that Saul may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And then, verse 18 gives us the defining physical detail of the story. It says, "Immediately, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again." Luke, the author of Acts, is describing a physical reality. But in the architecture of this story, the physical is always mirroring the spiritual. The scales are not just a medical condition. They are the final symbol of what has been happening to Saul over the last 3 days. For his entire adult life, a hardened crust had formed over his spiritual vision. His pride, his violent certainty, his flawless religious resume, his hatred for anything outside his own tradition, all of it had created a thick, impenetrable layer over his eyes. He thought he was seeing perfectly, but he was looking through the distorted scales of his own self-righteousness. When the scales hit the floor, it is the physical evidence that the old system has finally fallen away. The Pharisee is dead. The apostle is taking his first breath. The text says he got up and was baptized. Then he ate some food and regained his strength. The 3 days in the tomb are over. The fast is broken. The resurrection has happened. The man who was dead in his own blinding certainty has been brought back to life by the touch of the very people he tried to destroy. Saul finally has true sight, not because he kept the law perfectly, but because the unmerited grace of God shattered his darkness. The physical healing in that room was immediate, but the spiritual healing that began when the scales fell would go on to shape the rest of human history. When the scales fell from Saul's eyes in that quiet room in Damascus, His physical sight was restored, but his way of seeing the world was permanently changed. The man who walked out of that house was not the same man who was led into it by the hand 3 days earlier. Saul the Pharisee had died in the dark. Paul the Apostle was born in the light. And for the rest of his life, Paul never forgot what it meant to be blind. If you read the letters of Paul carefully, you will notice a recurring theme. He constantly uses the language of light, darkness, and spiritual vision. And he does not use these words as abstract theological concepts. He writes about them like a man who has lived them. In his second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 4, he writes about people who do not understand the gospel, and he diagnoses their condition using the exact experience of his own past. He writes, "The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ." Paul knew exactly what that kind of blindness felt like. He had lived inside it. He knew what it was like to be incredibly religious, heavily educated, perfectly moral by human standards, and entirely blind to the glory of Christ. But in that same passage, he explains how that blindness is cured. He writes, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." He is not just writing systematic theology. He is writing his autobiography. He is remembering the dirt road. He is remembering the flash from heaven. He is remembering the moment when the God who created the universe out of nothing commanded light to pierce his own darkened heart. This is why, when Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, his great prayer for them is not for wealth, or safety, or even better behavior. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 18, he writes, "I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you." The eyes of your heart. Paul knew that physical sight was not enough. You can read the text, you can know the rules, you can defend the traditions, but until the eyes of the heart are opened by the grace of God, you are just stumbling in the dark, convinced that you are walking in the light. The story of the Damascus Road is not just a historical account of how the early church survived its greatest threat. It is the definitive picture of how grace actually works. Grace does not just give us new information. Grace dismantles our false certainty. God did not take Saul's eyes to punish him. He took his eyes to save him. He had to break the violent momentum of a man who thought he could earn heaven through his own purity. He had to force him into a place of absolute helplessness. He had to reduce him to a beggar in the dark, so that he could finally receive the grace he had spent his life fighting against. The blindness was not a penalty. It was a severe mercy. The 3 days in the dark were not a prison. They were a cocoon. The scales falling to the floor were not just a medical miracle. They were the end of the old system of works, and the beginning of the new covenant of grace. If this study has helped you see the story of Scripture with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next deep dive. The Damascus Road is a warning, and it is a promise. It warns us that we can have perfect religion and still be completely blind, but it promises us that no matter how deep our darkness is, the light of Christ is strong enough to break through. The blindness was never just a punishment. It was the quiet, devastating, beautiful architecture of a man learning how to truly see.